Next on KQED Newsroom, should fair and open internet access be protected? The debate over net neutrality. An environmental crime on the rise, stealing burl off redwood trees.
You know, the most blatant cut we've seen, you're literally, 5 yards from the roadway.
Plus, Yosemite turns 150 years old. Some of the human stories behind all that history on display.
The sacredness of that landscape, whether you've seen it 100 times or whether you've been there 100 times, is so overwhelming and beautiful.
Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Earlier this week, demonstrators protested at Google in Mountain View. They want the internet to remain open without access fees or censorship by internet service providers. The concept is known as net neutrality. The issue is heating up now because the FCC is considering new rules for the internet. A public comment period ends July 15th. The issue gained high-speed momentum after comedian John Oliver highlighted it recently on his HBO show. It generated so many comments to the FCC that it crashed the agency's website. Here's a clip from last week tonight with John Oliver.
Net neutrality is actually hugely important. Essentially, it means that all data has to be treated equally, no matter who creates it. It's why the internet is a weirdly level playing field. And startups can supplant established brands. That's how Facebook supplanted MySpace, which supplanted Friendster, which supplanted actually having any friends. Do you remember physically having friends? It was awful. You couldn't tap people's faces to make them go away. The point...
Well, here to examine this debate further are April Glaser with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Bob McMillan, senior writer at Wired, and Laura Sydell, NPR digital culture correspondent. And Laura, John Oliver having some fun there with this issue, but it's serious. Net neutrality, it can sound pretty wonky, pretty dry. Break this down. Why should we care?
Okay, so the most basic reason you should care is so that, for example, if CNN can afford to make sure that its videos get to you faster, they will pay the money, and suppose PBS can't. So PBS public broadcasting on the internet would suddenly be in a slow lane because they wouldn't be able to pay the extra fee. Now, if you're a viewer, who are you going to watch? Are you going to watch CNN or are you going to watch PBS? When you sit there going, and it's buffering, you'll move over to CNN. So that's the core of the issue.
So the issue is not only business interests, but really a matter of free speech, too.
That's right. And over time, so now Netflix is huge. Netflix can afford to pay a lot of money to get its traffic to you rapidly. Whereas the next Netflix or the next YouTube or the next startup may not be able to afford it. They'll need a lot more investment money. We've been in a world where Mark Zuckerberg could sit in his dorm room and with $50 a month, he could start Facebook, and it would get to everybody at the same speed. But the fear is that the cable companies, Comcast, Time Warner, would start to charge a fee for the last mile into the home and say, we're going to create a lane, a faster lane, so you can pay a little extra, and we'll make sure that your traffic, your videos, whatever it is you're selling, gets to the consumer faster.
So the FCC is currently trying to draw up new open internet rules. The deadline for the public comment period coming up July 15th. April, realistically, though, how much can the FCC regulate this, given that a federal court already ruled in January that it doesn't have the authority to regulate it right now?
Well, the FCC can do a lot, but in order to actually regulate, the FCC is going to have to change the way the internet is classified. What the court said was that as the internet is currently classified, which is as an information service, the FCC can't apply the same kinds of public interest requirements that it can apply to, say, a telecommunications service or a common carrier. So the FCC is going to actually have to do some kind of regulatory reshuffling, and so it has the proper amount of power to actually put some kind of public interest requirements over the internet, because we need internet. We use it every day. It's essential to our lives, and we need to start treating it like it's as important as it is. And the FCC needs to have the power to regulate it properly.
So, Bob, the internet was actually classified in the 1990s as an information service, not so much like a telecommunications industry, a service provider. Given that, what are the big internet service providers like Comcast or Verizon saying about all this?
Well, they don't like the idea of regulation. They want to do whatever their business dictates. So they're very much opposed to the idea of applying sort of these common carrier regulations that we have on railways and airlines, to the internet. The internet is kind of exceptional in that it very much acts like a common carrier. Everybody uses it like a common carrier, but it hasn't been regulated that way. So they don't like it, but there's sort of a growing sentiment that something needs to be done. Even though the internet has been very successful as this sort of unregulated, freewheeling world, it's getting older, and some people are pushing for regulation there.
I mean, it's changed a lot. I mean, back when it was, when there was less of a need for regulation, there were a lot more internet providers out there. We used to have a lot more choices, but right now the market is very consolidated. Where there used to be many options for internet access into your home, now there's usually only one option or two at most for high-speed fiber to your home.
And I should add, and that is because actually the government did give various companies like Comcast monopolies over certain areas in order to encourage them to build out. Well, now they've built out, and I think there's another way to solve this problem would be what they do in Europe is they basically force the carriers to sell at a market price to other competitors so that there would be other people using those lines, and that would start to bring the price down and maybe prevent the threat of blocking traffic or creating
We're sort of in this weird situation now where the internet is totally amazing. There's all this great stuff that happens on it. So on the one hand, you can say, well, why should we mess with it? On the other hand, the cable companies and companies like AT&T have had some really bad ideas about what to do on the internet. If you look at the net neutrality debate going back 10 years, the debate was over whether you could have things like voice over IP or whether you could have a router in your house. There's this sense that these big companies are going to pursue their interests and that they have too much power right now.
But a lot of the debate has been over this concept of the fast lanes, that if you're a big company like a Google or Facebook, you can afford to put your content on the fast lane and deliver it in a more efficient, quicker way to households. But is that missing the mark? Because a lot of the big companies already are in the fast lane.
Well, I mean, I wrote an article about this week, and basically my argument was that if we worry too much about fast lanes, we're going to ignore the sort of competitive side of things. And there are actually other issues that are really important. Now, there's obviously a free speech
traffic shaping
side.
is only one part, is only one way that internet providers can discriminate. There are other ways that internet providers can discriminate as well. And it's not just about, giving one company faster access to subscribers, which essentially lets ISPs act as the gatekeepers to subscribers. It's also about, people's attention. I mean, what's happening is if you have a fast website and a slow website, you're going to go to that fast website. The ISPs, our internet providers, are essentially, acting as censors.
Prioritizing, if you will.
I should add, there's another possibility here, too, which, for example, Comcast owns NBC, and for now, because of another agreement they made, they can't do anything. But at some point, Comcast could decide to promote NBC over other content producers. So the concern, too, is that you'll end up somehow with those kinds of arrangements.
Yeah, it's these dark clouds on the horizon. I'm really concerned about the sort of middlemen in the internet. There are a lot of, the reason that somebody like Mark Zuckerberg could start a Facebook and build it out is because there are all these companies in between, that aren't Google, that aren't Comcast, that provide internet connectivity, and it's a competitive, vibrant marketplace. And if if the consumer ISPs get too powerful, there's a worry that that marketplace could be squeezed out.
And there already is a sign that in fact, that is beginning. Netflix was having problems getting its traffic through one of these sort of early people. They bring the traffic to that pipe that then goes towards your house. And they were having problems. Their traffic wasn't going through. So they made a special deal with Comcast, and they're paying extra to get directly to Comcast. So you're already seeing something start to shift
And
there.
what's interesting in this situation is now you have a situation where there are big corporations like Netflix, like Google, actually siding with the activists, and they've signed an open letter supporting net neutrality.
They have, yes. Over 150 companies came out and signed that letter in support of net neutrality to the FCC.
What about the point that the internet service providers are making, though, that government regulation slows down innovation? They've invested a lot of money in these pipelines. Shouldn't they be allowed to charge more to help recoup some of the investments they've made?
At this point, it's not a matter of slowing down innovation. Right now, we actually need rules to allow for innovation, because we have these large incumbent companies that will be able to afford to make it to the fast lane. We'll be able to afford to pay internet providers to reach customers faster. But new innovative companies won't be able to afford that. I mean, maybe a few years ago they needed less rules so that way they could innovate, but we're in a different space now. The internet's changed a lot since 2002, since 2005.
I mean, the big issue at this point has to do with something, and here it's my eyes glaze over moment, Title II, and whether or not the FCC should reclassify internet as something called Title II, which is where we put the phone company and the electricity companies.
We absolutely need to do that.
And a lot of people feel, I don't know that Google...
Why aren't they doing it, though?
This is a good question.
Well, the FCC needs to reclassify the internet as Title II, as a common carrier, so that way it actually has the authority and the power to tell ISPs what they can and can't do.
But why isn't it reclassified?
Well, the reason why it wasn't classified as a common carrier before was because back in 2002, we actually needed less rules to have perhaps more competition, but we're in a different environment right now.
Also, but the internet has done really well without regulation, and there's a sentiment amongst many people, even in the tech community, that without these regulations, you know, the Title II could enter the dawn.
Could I jump in one question and just get to
very spirited, very
political heart here, which is that I think the chairman of the FCC is worried about Congress fighting really hard to prevent him from doing this. And there's already a sign they're going to do that. The Republicans in Congress have already tried.
We will leave it there. Laura Sydell, April Glaser, and Bob McMillan, thank you so much. Well, last week, a Northern California man was ordered to pay more than $11,000 in restitution for stealing part of a tree. He's the second person to be convicted this month for chopping burl off a redwood in a national park. From our partners at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, a look at why the environmental crime is prompting alarm and a crackdown.
State Park Ranger Brett Silver is on high alert for unwanted visitors. Suspicious trails in the park have recently led rangers to some unusual crime scenes.
Some rangers on patrol, they noticed this game trail looked a bit heavily used, so they went for a hike. And this is what they found. 18 cuts on this tree alone.
This redwood was robbed of its burls, the knobby growths often found at the base of the trunk.
This one to your right, one to your left.
Burls are critical to the survival of redwoods because new trees can regenerate from them, says Ranger Jeff Denny.
From that burl, you can get an identical clone of that tree that can live for another 2,000 years.
California's coast redwoods once covered more than 2 million acres from Monterey to the Oregon border. Today, due to logging, only about 5% of them remain. The tallest trees in the world now face a new threat. Burl poaching during the past 2 years has gotten worse. Burl slabs can sell for hundreds to thousands of dollars. There are only 12 rangers to protect 132,000 acres of dense forest, and they're worried the poaching problem is much bigger than they've seen.
I think we've only just seen the tip of the iceberg. These are just the ones that are kind of obvious. You know, the most blatant cut we've seen, you're literally, 5 yards from the roadway.
The loss of timber jobs in the region has led to a spike in crime in general, says Sheriff Wayne Hansen.
The thefts in the last 10 years have just skyrocketed. Main motives are sometimes drugs. They're trying to get money for drugs. Sometimes people just don't want to work, and that's what they do, is they steal stuff to pawn it.
Authorities have closed roads at night and boosted patrols, but poachers seem to be going bigger and bolder. This recovered burl was 50 feet up in a tree, so poachers cut the whole tree down. The tree is estimated to have been 400 years old.
It was the first time that we've ever seen an entire old-growth redwood tree cut simply in order to obtain the burl that was on top of the tree.
The sleuthing is starting to pay off. An anonymous tip led to the arrest of 2 men from Oric, California, for making this cut. The burl was later found at a nearby shop. Both men pled guilty to felony vandalism and were ordered to pay more than $12,000 in combined restitution. The once booming timber industry provided woodworkers with plenty of redwood. That industry has since collapsed, and with it, the supply of valuable burl.
Redwood is kind of like a treasure chest. You can take a gray piece of wood, and it just looks gray and plain. To some people, it looks like a piece of firewood, and you cut into it, and the beauty that you get out of it is unexplainable.
Jim Perotti turned the beauty of burl into a lucrative business. His Berkeley shop sells furniture to clients around the world.
This is a table that went to the president of China. I made the top. It is old-growth redwood.
Pieces like these sell for thousands of dollars. Perotti says he gets his burl legally from tree stumps on private land.
Like, say, a typical deal, Farmer Joe's going to pasture his land, and he's got a bunch of derelict stumps sitting out in his field. You kick that out of the ground, and usually there's some really nice wood under there.
While Perotti's business is legitimate, Ranger Denny suspects there might be a burl black market on the internet.
You can go online and look at any of the auction sites or Craigslist, eBay, any of those kinds of places, and find burl being sold.
These Craigslist sellers say they acquired the burl slabs legally from family-owned land or from friends. In the meantime, more criminal investigations are happening. Rangers are hoping consumers can play a role in solving the problem.
What I would like to see when people who are buying from vendors or businesses, that they really ask the tough question of, well, where did this come from? And usually what they'll say is, well, it came from private land. But there isn't any kind of proof. We got this one here.
Rangers say thieves are selling off more than mere pieces of wood.
Right, one to your left.
The coast redwood forests are a destination for people around the world. So by stealing pieces of this heritage, you're stealing from all of us.
150 years ago this month, President Abraham Lincoln set aside the first public lands in the country for resort and recreation, Yosemite Valley. An exhibit opening Monday at the California Historical Society in San Francisco looks at the human stories that are part of Yosemite's history. Executive Director Anthea Hartig shared some of those stories with Scott Shafer.
Anthea Hartig, welcome.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure.
Take us back to 1864, if you would. President Lincoln signs the Yosemite Grant Act. What role did photography have on him, do you think? It was right during the Civil War. He was seeing photos of the dead that Matthew Brady was doing.
Right.
And photography was new at the time.
Brand new, and the first photographer in the Yosemite Valley was only in 1859, and it was Carlton Watkins who comes in 1861, develops a whole new way of a large-size camera, which he called the mammoth print, so they could take extra large photographs to try and somehow capture the beauty of that scenery. And Watkins' show premiered at the Gallery in New York, where Matthew Brady's photographs had just been. So here are Brady's photographs of carnage on corpses on the battlefields, and in comes, Watkins with Yosemite. And we know that the state senator from California who proposed the Yosemite Act and got it through Congress had a set of Watkins, like we have at the California Historical Society, and we're pretty sure showed them to Lincoln.
Yeah.
So how could he not be so swayed by that beauty?
Yeah, and of course there's so many iconic photos now, Ansel Adams, of course, and others, El Capitan, Half Dome. But this is much more than that. This exhibit is really described as a human history of the park. What does that mean?
Correct. Well, when you think of the almost 10,000 years of human occupation and sculpting and use of what we call Yosemite, we wanted to bring forth some of those remarkable stories. So in the galleries, there are about 23 stories, and then in our accompanying ebook, there's a couple dozen more.
Give us an example of one that stands out for you.
One of the more beautiful ones that stands out for me is the story of Julia Parker, who still is alive, a beautiful, beautiful soul, who was sent, like many California Indians, to boarding school, an Indian boarding school in Nevada, meets her husband. He's from the valley, he's from the Yosemite Valley. So he comes, brings his beautiful bride home and introduces us to her mother and his grandmother and his aunties, who are all, you know, basket makers of the highest order. And she didn't even know anymore what she said it was like to be an Indian, never mind to be an Indian basket maker. So she goes on to be one of the most acclaimed basket makers ever, and she's asked to make a basket for the Queen of England when she's visiting in the 1960s.
And there's a picture of her presenting that basket to her and Prince Philip, I think.
Absolutely. And her family, who are Pomo here from the northern coast, saw the picture in the newspaper and reconnected with her.
Wow.
Never having known her, never having seen her.
Wow.
And turns out she is a descendant from the most amazing basket maker of the Pomo. So.
There are some photos in this exhibit that are kind of like double take. You do a double take. Like there's one of a bear standing on its hind legs with a woman maybe 6 feet away.
Right.
Is that a real bear?
That's a real bear that was trained by the park's first female naturalist in the 1920s, this spectacular woman named Enid. And at the time, bears were supposed to be like pets, especially smaller bears, obviously. And
so that wasn't a grizzly.
That was a black bear. The grizzlies had been gone from the valley since the 1880s. And in the exhibition, we show one of the last grizzlies shot in the valley. And so it describes for us this tension between how natural should it be and the ways in which man and nature and culture have kind of wrestled in that. Now, of course, we don't feed the bears. There's a keep bears wild policy, and it's kind of gone the other way in terms of feeding bears sugar cubes, which is what Enid was doing with them. Yeah.
Well, it seemed happy. It seemed like a happy bear.
Happy relationship.
There was another photo of these two women, dressed in the garb of the day, long dresses, I believe, standing on top of these pine tree, a limb of a pine tree.
Right.
It almost looks photoshopped.
Yeah. Right. So that pine tree grew out of solid granite at 4,000 feet, and not surprisingly was one of the most photographed trees in the park until it died in 2003. But these women kind of playfully standing on the tree that Ansel Adams shot and that so many others shot before him, again is this, I think, this wonderful symbol of how we got to know Yosemite, largely through photographs at first. And how we're displaying a lot of it through photographs in the gallery, but what kind of special magic happens when we go there?
There is a rich history in the park of climbing.
Absolutely.
And how does that play out in the exhibit?
We bring forth the really amazing story of climbing starting in about 1958, but really reaches its moment as California, of course, is going through wrenching changes, cultural, social changes in the 1960s. And we see the show through the eyes, especially of Glenn Denny, who's still alive. He lives here in San Francisco. Went into the park first to photograph and then started to climb. And he has this wonderful, wonderful quote that the air was his platform, that they learned, like Muybridge and Watkins before them, they took these daring, feats of photographic courage as they climbed. And then, of course, as climbing evolved into the kind of free climbing, this amazing, death-defying culture. And they all camped out at Camp 4, because it was the only free park, the only free campground at the park, and created this really vibrant, interesting kind of hippie climbing culture.
What about you? You told me earlier, a third-generation Californian. Do you have your own rich memories of Yosemite?
I do. It was interesting. Like many Californians, I went all over the world before I went to Yosemite, which you can say is phenomenally sad. And of course, I knew it through photography and as a California historian. And it was only when our two sons were small, about 10 years ago, that we first went. And the sacredness of that landscape, whether you've seen it 100 times or whether you've been there 100 times, is so overwhelming and beautiful.
And just quickly, this is an interactive exhibit, I'm sure. I mean, there are
Absolutely.
things that kids can do. It's very
Lots
family
of things,
friendly.
Family friendly, beautiful visuals, over literally hundreds of different objects, artifacts, videos.
And showing through
January 25th. You have the whole rest of the year.
All right, Anthea Hartig, thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Great, thank you.
And now for a look at what's coming up on KQED News is Scott Shafer. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Twee.
Well, we just heard your interview about the 150th anniversary of President Lincoln preserving Yosemite Park. Yet a bill to expand Yosemite is stalled in Congress, and the man who's standing in the way of that expansion is the man who represents the district, Tom McClintock.
Very ironic.
Yes.
Tom McClintock, well known as a Tea Party Republican, small government, says he doesn't want to expand the park and buy that additional property that's available because he doesn't trust the National Park Service. And so it's actually become something of an issue in the congressional race there. He came in first in the June primary, but he's running against another Republican in the November election, Art Moore, who supports expanding it. So it's kind of this classic face-off between a Tea Party Republican and a more mainstream Republican. We'll see how that issue plays out in that race.
That'll be interesting to watch. Also, something else coming up this fall, another election issue, public safety, a measure to reduce penalties for some crimes. Under what circumstances?
Well, what they want to do, this is a ballot measure that's supported by George Gascon, the DA in San Francisco, and other law enforcement officials. They want to reduce the sentences from felonies to misdemeanors for relatively small crimes like petty theft, certain drug possessions, that kind of thing. Again, it's part of this whole idea of decriminalizing drug kinds of crimes, sending them to rehabilitation instead of to prison, and so that will be on the ballot in November.
And there's been a bill about the death penalty circulating. What's happening with that?
That one is supported by all the former governors and the more hardline anti-crime groups, district attorneys. They're collecting signatures for it, but the deadline was yesterday to get it on the November ballot, so it may be on a future ballot, but not November.
So maybe 2016 for that. Also, this didn't get much attention, but it's important. The state Supreme Court on Thursday issued a 5-2 decision saying that effectively that undocumented immigrants can file for workers' compensation.
That's right. There's involved a worker over in San Joaquin County, was disabled, hurt his back on the job. Long story short, he sued the employer for not hiring him back, and also he wanted workers' comp benefits. Because he was undocumented, there was thinking that perhaps he couldn't be eligible for those, but the court said no, federal law does not preempt undocumented immigrants. Even if they lie to get their job and present false papers, they're still entitled to those protections. And that could affect a lot of workers in California.
Do you think more will step forward?
1 out of 11 workers are undocumented, and if there are wage disputes, sexual harassment claims, they could now come forward to court.
Okay, very interesting. Scott, thank you.
You bet.
And for all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org.
I'm Scott Shafer. Thanks for joining us.
And I'm Twee Vu. Have a good night.